Hey everyone, welcome to our last set of notes on the respiratory system. If you have not done so already, I'm going to get you to pause the video and go to the book of videos on our Moodle under the respiratory chapter and watch videos 2 and 3 on gas exchange and internal-external respiration. Okay, pause the video, watch those 2 videos first, and then restart the video. Okay, so hopefully watching those 2 videos gives you the big picture and puts everything in perspective. And we're now going to go through the details of gas exchange in the body. All right, and we refer to gas exchange as internal and external respiration because it occurs in 2 different places. And students will often confuse, breathing in and out with internal and external respiration. So we want to make sure we understand when you inhale and exhale, we call this, well, that's inhalation, exhalation. That's the exchange of air from the outside to your lungs and from your lungs to the outside. But the actual exchange of gases, the exchange of CO2 and O2 is referred to as internal and external respiration. So internal respiration refers to the exchange between your tissues and the capillaries of your blood. So that's internal because it's happening within your body at the tip of your finger or deep in your liver or down in your quadricep of your leg, anywhere deep within the body or even on the surface of the skin. The exchange of gases between tissues and capillaries is referred to as internal. External is the exchange between the capillaries and the alveoli at your lungs. Alveoli at your within your lungs, right? So external because eventually that stuff is on the way out and it's exposed to the external environment, right? Internal within the body. So interestingly enough, the fluid of your body, which is mostly water, water does not really dissolve oxygen very well, or CO2 for that matter. And so it has a limited capacity. If you think about dissolving, when you add teaspoons of salt into water, well, water dissolves salt very, very well. And you could add teaspoon after teaspoon and stir, and it'll dissolve, and it'll keep dissolving for quite amount, right? Quite a large amount. With oxygen and carbon dioxide, however, there's a limited amount in which the water can dissolve. And so therefore the body needs alternative means to transport these gases rather than just simply dissolved in the fluid of the blood. And so we're going to look at the reactions involved that are all part of transporting the gases and exchanging the gases within different environments. Now, ultimately, as we've said before, the whole process involves diffusion. And just like when we talked about the diffusion of solutes, that things diffuse from high concentration to low concentration, the same is true of gases. We don't refer to the amount of gases as concentration. We refer to the amount of gases as pressure. And so when we see a P in front of the O2, this is referring to the partial pressure of oxygen, right? And similarly, the P in front of the CO2 is the partial pressure of CO2. But the principle still applies that gases will diffuse from high partial pressure to low, right? So if you remember, we talked about high concentration to low concentration. Well, the same is true for high partial pressure, right, to low partial pressure. So gases still diffuse in that same format, high to low. So now we need to look at the processes that drive the movement of those gases. So first and foremost, we need to make sure that we understand that it's not just pressure that drives the diffusion of materials, but also temperature and pH have a significant impact on the movement of both oxygen and carbon dioxide. And we'll explain that as we go. So first off, with it internal, we're going to start deep inside your body somewhere. You know, we could be within your kidney, or like I said, your big toe, right? We're within some tissues, right? So this is within the body. We're in some group of tissues. And what we have to remember is that in these groups of cells in this tissue, cellular respiration occurs, right? Cellular respiration is taking place, and what we need to remember is that in that process, glucose combining with oxygen is producing CO2, water, and what we really want is the ATP, right? The energy to drive all the metabolic processes occurring in cells. But the byproduct, the unfortunate byproduct of the process of generating this ATP is the production of CO2. And so as cells carry out their activities, CO2 is building up within this cell. And so the partial pressure inside here would be high. And so therefore CO2 would diffuse from in the cell to the interstitial fluid. And again, if you remember histology and talking about the importance of this interstitial fluid, that is dissolved gases and minerals, charged ions, there's hormones, there's proteins, there's all kinds of substances in this interstitial fluid that are meant to be maintained in a homeostatic, in a homeostasis balance, right? So as CO2 diffuses into this interstitial space, well, again, its concentration becomes high. And so ultimately, it's going to be dissolved into plasma, all right? And it's going to build up in here, and the blood needs a way in which to deal with this buildup of CO2. Well, where it comes from is first the release of oxygen occurring as the red blood cell enters into the tissue region. So as the red blood cell, so here's our first sort of reaction, chemical reaction that's occurring as this oxygen-rich blood enters into our tissue. The hemoglobin, which we abbreviate with the words HB, right? The hemoglobin is carrying oxygen in the red blood cell. And as this red blood cell enters into the tissue region, there is a slight change in pH and temperature. So the temperature, whereas our normal body temperature, we might say, is about 37 degrees Celsius, deep within our body, there's a slight increase, which makes sense, right? More insulation. We have about a 38 degrees Celsius temperature change, and the pH is just slightly more acidic, pH of maybe 7.2 compared to normal blood, or on average, blood is about 7.4. So these changes, these conditions, so remember back here we said temperature and pH play a big role in driving these reactions. These changes in pH and temperature alter hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen. And by altering its affinity, it causes hemoglobin to release oxygen. All right? And I know it seems funny, but this is a chemical reaction. The actual process by which hemoglobin binds oxygen and the process by which it releases. And the reaction can go in either direction. But in reality, down in the tissues, the reaction is driven in one direction because of the physiological conditions of pH and temperature. And of course, as hemoglobin releases the oxygen into the plasma, the concentration builds up, I should say the partial pressure, right? The partial pressure of oxygen becomes high, and just like with the CO2, it begins diffusing into the interstitial space and continues diffusing into the tissues where it can be used by the mitochondria to help with cellular respiration. So now once the hemoglobin, and now what we really need to appreciate is that the hemoglobin in the red blood cell, there's as many as, there's hundreds of millions of hemoglobin proteins within a single red blood cell, hundreds of millions. And once they've released oxygen, they now become available to actually pick up carbon dioxide. So as you grow up, I think probably you've come across, and we've learned somewhere in our science courses that, you know, hemoglobin is this protein that carries oxygen, but we've never really been told and realized that it actually carries carbon dioxide as well. And so here's where the blood starts dealing with this buildup of carbon dioxide. Hemoglobin can bind onto carbon dioxide, forming this molecule, HbCO2, which we call carb amino hemoglobin. And so as this CO2 builds up in the plasma, the CO2 is going to dissolve into the red blood cell, diffuse into the red blood cell, and hemoglobin is going to pick it up. And as hemoglobin starts to pick up this CO2, the concentration decreases in the plasma, and now more CO2 can dissolve. So it's this multi-step process to kind of encourage CO2 to keep dissolving into the blood plasma to get rid of it. Now, fortunately, there's other ways in which we can deal with this excess CO2, and this comes from the fact that not only is water produced via cellular respiration, but remember the plasma is predominantly water, right? Water is the solvent of all of our fluids and interstitial fluid, cytoplasm, etc. And so there's this enormous amount of water making up our blood plasma. And there's a second reaction that occurs between carbon dioxide and water in the plasma. Now, part of why this reaction doesn't occur so much in our cells, or to a much lesser extent, is because this reaction in the plasma, and in particular in the red blood cell where the CO2 starts diffusing, is the presence of an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase. And this carbonic anhydrase catalyzes this reaction, and it converts CO2 and water into carbonic acid. And that carbonic acid, as any acid, we learned in chapter 2, dissociates into its ions, in this case, H plus and HCO3. And although it might not look obvious, we've dealt with the CO2 by tying it up in this compound here, which I hope we recognize as the bicarbonate ion. Now, back to the role of carbonic anhydrase. So what it's doing, so I'll do this in black here, but present within our red blood cells is the enzyme carbonic anhydrase. And essentially it is catalyzing, anhydrase. I can never talk and write at the same time. It is catalyzing this step right here. So it's acting as the enzyme on these substrates, right? Carbon dioxide and water. And it's catalyzing the reaction to produce carbonic acid, all right? Carbonic acid. And so now carbonic acid in any water-based environment, like any acid, is going to dissociate into H plus and HCO3 minus. Now, there's one further side reaction because this increase in H plus becomes a problem, right? The H plus that's being produced, as the concentration of H plus increases, think about what's happening to pH. pH will drop. But remember, pH is a homeostatic condition. We can't have pH dropping significantly in our blood, or we'd be in a lot of trouble, right? So the H plus is building up in within the blood plasma, and more specifically in in the red blood cell. But enter another um, benefit of hemoglobin, and that is that hemoglobin, and I'm going to call this D, all right, and I'm running out of space here, but I'm going to squeeze it in down at the bottom because I want to put something else in here with C. But this hydrogen ion that is being produced through this reaction above is taken up by hemoglobin. Hemoglobin literally acts as a buffer, combining with the hydrogen ions, forming this substance, which we refer to as reduced hemoglobin. Sorry, I'm running out of space here, but I'm trying to keep everything together. Reduced hemoglobin. And so that helps to keep the pH of the plasma at a relatively stable level and maintain the integrity of enzymes and proteins as they go about their functions. So the last thing that I wanted to add in here with respect to carbon dioxide, so we've got three ways in which carbon dioxide is dealt with. So at the beginning, we started by indicating that cells are undergoing respiration, cellular respiration. They're producing enormous amounts of CO2 that flood the plasma, and the plasma needs a way to deal with them. So first of all, hemoglobin binds carbon dioxide, taking it up as this molecule carbaminohemoglobin, helping to reduce levels of CO2. Secondly, the enzyme carbonic anhydrase catalyzes the conversion of CO2. So as CO2 builds up and moves into the red blood cells, there it combines with water and is converted into carbonic acid, which dissociates to H plus and HCO3 minus. And so even though it might not seem like it, by combining the carbon dioxide with hydrogen, it actually is using up carbon dioxide, reducing that CO2 in the plasma. And so there's the second scenario in which we deal with excess CO2. And the third scenario is just simply whatever's left remains dissolved. So the third way, CO2 from the tissues simply is transported and remains dissolved in the plasma. And so there's going to be some CO2 left, but a very small percentage relative to what's being carried by hemoglobin or the bicarbonate ion. And then this is a great way to show that this buildup of H plus, which could create a problem, combines with hemoglobin to produce that reduced hemoglobin and keep the pH constant within the blood cell and the plasma. So that's internal gas exchange. I'm going to pause the video and put up another video, or I'm going to stop this video and put up the second video for looking at external respiration, and we'll go much quicker.